Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. We're diving into the wacky world of idioms today. You know those sayings that make absolutely no sense if you take them literally?
Right, right, like spill the tea.
Exactly. Or kick the bucket. It's like, where did these phrases come from?
It's a mystery.
It really is. But today we're on an idiom odyssey to uncover those hidden stories, to figure out why we use these quirky phrases.
Yeah, it's amazing how they add, I don't know, just add color to language. Just like these little snapshots into history and culture, even humor.
Totally. Like each idiom is a little time capsule, right? You
Yeah.
pop it open and boom, suddenly you're back in a different era.
I like that, yeah.
Okay, so let's crack open our first time capsule with a phrase that's, well, it's quintessentially British.
Okay.
Bob's your uncle,
Oh, I love that one.
right?
It's so fun.
It is. I mean, it's such a funny way of saying, there you have it, easy peasy. But who is Bob? And why is he everyone's uncle?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Now, the most common explanation you hear is that it's linked to a little bit of nepotism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, involving British Prime Minister Robert Bob Gascoigne Cecil.
Okay.
He appointed his nephew to a really prominent government position in the late 19th century.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that story. It's almost too perfect, right?
It's a good story.
It is.
Right.
Want a shortcut to success, just make sure Bob's your uncle.
Right, exactly. But as with many of these stories that sound too good to be true, there might be some holes in this one.
Really? So are you saying Prime Minister Bob is not the Bob we're looking for?
Well, we can't say for sure, but the thing is, the phrase Bob's your uncle, it doesn't actually show up in print until the 1920s, which is a bit,
Wait, seriously, that's after he was Prime Minister.
yeah, that throws a bit of a wrench in the theory, right?
It does. So the Prime Minister Bob connection, it's just a coincidence.
Seems very likely. But of course, with anything like this, there are other theories floating around.
Like what?
Well, some people connect it to this 1930 song, Follow Your Uncle Bob. Kind of catchy.
Okay.
But then others think it might be even older and related to slang uses of the word Bob. Honestly, the truth is, the exact origins, it's still a mystery.
So Bob's your uncle is basically a linguistic puzzle with a big question mark at the end of it.
Precisely. And what's fascinating to me is that even without a definitive origin story, it's not only survived, but thrived. It's become so deeply ingrained, particularly in British English. And I think it captures that, that dry, witty humor we often associate with British culture.
Right. And it's interesting because even though we might not know its exact roots, we instinctively understand how to use it. Like if I said, just add a pinch of salt, give it a good stir, and Bob's your uncle, you've got yourself a delicious meal.
Perfect.
It just adds this air of casual confidence. And there you have it.
Absolutely. It's like this linguistic shortcut to say it's as simple as that. And it just highlights, I think, how much we as humans love finding patterns and narratives, even when it comes to language.
You love a good story.
We do. We can't resist one, even if it's not entirely accurate.
Speaking of stories, let's move on to another idiom that conjures up a pretty vivid image. The elephant in the room. I mean, talk about an awkward guest, right?
Oh, tell me about it. It's this giant, unavoidable presence that everyone's just desperately trying to ignore.
Exactly. And it's such a powerful metaphor for those unspoken truths, those sensitive issues that everyone's aware of, but nobody wants to address directly, whether it's in a business meeting or a family gathering or even, on a global political stage.
Oh, absolutely. Like you can have an entire diplomatic summit with an elephant in the room.
Totally. Imagine you're at a dinner party and there's been this huge argument between two guests earlier in the day.
Oh, gross.
Oh, worst. But everyone knows about it. But everyone's pretending everything's fine, sipping their wine, making small talk. And this massive elephant is just standing there.
It's just looming.
Looming.
And the reason why I think that idiom resonates so strongly with people is that it gives us this language to actually name and navigate those situations.
Okay.
Right? By simply saying, look, there's an elephant in the room. We acknowledge it, right? We break the tension, and then hopefully it opens the door for more honest communication. It's almost like giving that, giving that unspoken tension, like a physical form.
Yeah.
Something you can point to and be like, okay, let's deal with this. Because ignoring it rarely makes it go away.
Never. It usually just makes things more awkward. But you know what else I find interesting about the elephant in the room?
Okay.
It's not just an idiom. It's become a cultural touchstone.
It really has.
You see it referenced everywhere, like books, movies, even political cartoons.
Oh, absolutely, because it's
Yeah.
that shared understanding, right? That collective recognition of those unspoken truths
Yeah.
that gives it such power. And it just highlights how these idioms, they can evolve from these simple phrases to these really potent metaphors. Like, they really reflect our shared human experience.
Okay, ready for our next idiom adventure?
Always.
This one's a bit darker,
Ooh.
and it involves a wild journey
Okay.
through history, myth, and the power of language, like to shape perception.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Get ready to unpack basket case.
Ah, yes. Basket case. It's a phrase that we use a lot today to describe someone who's, completely overwhelmed, stressed out, maybe even a little, well, messy.
Right, like I had 3 deadlines, a flat tire, and a fight with my landlord. I'm a total basket case today.
Mhm.
But the meaning, it's changed a lot because the origins of this phrase are actually rooted in a myth
Yes.
that came out of World War One.
That's right. The myth claimed that basket case referred to soldiers who had suffered such horrific injuries during the war, particularly the loss of all 4 limbs, that they literally had to be carried around in baskets.
Yeah, I've heard that one too.
Yeah.
It's a pretty gruesome image. But you're saying it's not true.
Not quite. So, while World War I undoubtedly resulted in, countless tragic and life-altering injuries, there's actually no historical evidence to support that specific claim, that there were soldiers who had lost all 4 limbs to the extent that they required transportation in baskets. In fact, the U.S. Surgeon General at the time, he explicitly refuted these claims.
Wow, so that's a pretty definitive debunking. So how did this myth take hold and more importantly, how did basket case go from this wartime fable to like an everyday expression of stress and overwhelm?
It's a really fascinating example of how even a phrase that's rooted in myth can still capture the collective imagination, especially during times of like heightened fear and uncertainty, like wartime.
Yeah.
And I think the image itself, this idea of a soldier so utterly shattered by war that he's reduced to a torso in a basket is powerful
Yeah.
and disturbing. And it really tapped into, some deep-seated anxieties, I think, about the horrors of war and the very real possibility of catastrophic injuries.
So even though it wasn't based on like factual accounts, the emotional truth behind it resonated.
Exactly.
And the phrase stuck.
And what's even more intriguing is how basket case then continued to evolve. Because by the 1940s, it starts being used to describe not just individuals, but like dysfunctional organizations, like a company on the brink of collapse.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I even found an article from 1948 where Life magazine was talking about the United Nations, and they were speculating whether it would, and this is a quote, become a more pathetic basket case than the old League of Nations.
So it went from this devastating physical state during wartime to like a metaphorical representation of total organizational breakdown?
Yeah, it's quite a leap.
That is.
And then it takes another turn because in the 1950s, it takes on this psychological dimension. So
Yeah.
now it's describing individuals who are experiencing, emotional overwhelm, anxiety, even mental breakdowns. And this evolution, I think, is incredibly revealing.
Right.
Because it suggests that at its core, this concept of a basket case, this idea of something or someone in a state of utter disarray, of dysfunction, it transcended its mythical origins. And it became this really versatile tool for expressing a whole spectrum of breakdown: physical, organizational, emotional.
It's amazing how language does that. Like it adapts and takes on new meanings and connotations.
It's constantly shifting.
It is. It travels through time. Though it is a good reminder to be mindful of the weight certain phrases carry, especially given their historical baggage. Speaking of linguistic journeys, I think it's time we hopped across the pond, don't you?
Oh, I was hoping you'd say that.
Let's dive into the vibrant world of British slang.
Oh, British slang.
Uh-huh.
It's like a linguistic playground,
Yeah.
full of wordplay and wit and these ever-shifting codes. It's just this fascinating reflection of how like social and cultural changes influence the way we speak.
Absolutely. Now, when I think British slang, the first thing that pops into my head is, I have to admit, Cockney rhyming slang,
Of course.
which always makes me feel like I'm trying to solve a riddle.
It is a bit of a puzzle, isn't it?
It's like a secret language within a language.
Exactly. And it emerged in the East End of London, probably around the mid-19th century. And it's essentially this form of wordplay where you replace a word with a rhyming phrase,
Mm.
often 2 words. And then just to make it even trickier, you might drop the second word of the rhyme, so it becomes even more,
Right, so instead of saying feet, you'd say plates of meat, or even just plates.
But-
I've always wondered, though, like, what was the purpose behind it? Was it just for fun?
Well, it certainly injected an element of playfulness and humor,
Yeah.
into everyday speech. It also had this really practical purpose
Yeah.
because it created a sense of in-group identity.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, it was even used to obscure meaning from outsiders.
Ah, so it was like their own little secret code.
Exactly.
I can see how that would be really useful, like, in a bustling marketplace or amongst a group of friends who didn't want others to understand what they were talking about.
Exactly. And it's a prime example of how language can be used to not just communicate, but to build community, to mark identity, and even to, resist those dominant cultural forces. It's fascinating. But British slang, of course, didn't stop evolving with Cockney rhyming slang. It's continued to adapt and absorb new influences. It's become this, incredibly diverse tapestry of words and phrases.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's constantly evolving. Think about all the influences that have shaped it. Military jargon, youth subcultures,
Yeah.
the arrival of new immigrant communities.
Fascinating.
It's an incredible linguistic melting pot. It
Yeah.
really is. It's like if you took a snapshot of British slang at any given moment, you'd capture this really unique blend of history and humor and cultural fusion.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most exciting developments in recent decades has been this emergence of multicultural London English, or MLE, as I think a lot of people are calling it these days.
Right, MLE.
Yeah, it's like this linguistic mixtape
I like that.
of London's diverse communities, drawing on influences from, Caribbean patois, West African languages, even like sprinkles of traditional Cockney rhyming slang in there.
It's amazing how this new form of slang reflects like the changing face of London.
Yeah.
It's blending all these different threads of language and culture into something totally new.
Exactly. It really demonstrates how language is, it's alive, it's constantly evolving. It reflects the changing demographics and the cultural landscape of a place. And what's been so fascinating to see is how MLE has gone from being this, localized dialect to actually influencing mainstream slang,
Wow.
not just in Britain, but globally.
Yeah.
And thanks in part, I think, to music and media. Oh, and the internet, of course.
Speaking of global influence, I think it's time we turn our attention across the pond to our American cousins. They've got a knack for crafting some pretty colorful idioms, too.
They certainly do. American English has developed this really distinct set of idioms, and they often draw on, different cultural references, different historical events than their British counterparts.
Right, so for example, when something's easy peasy in the US, they might say it's a piece of cake.
Exactly.
Simple as that.
Which I kind of like. It's a lovely image, isn't it?
It is.
Or if you're facing a really difficult decision, stuck between two undesirable options, they might say, between a rock and a hard place.
Ooh, that's a bit more, I don't know, it's a bit more evocative than between a devil and a deep blue sea,
It is, isn't it?
which I think is the British version.
Yeah. And speaking of evocative imagery, one of my favorite American idioms is, that's the bee's knees.
I know. Where did that come from?
It's so wonderfully nonsensical.
It is. It's like, why bees? Why knees?
Exactly.
But I guess that's the beauty of idioms, isn't it? They don't always make logical sense, but they capture a feeling,
They do.
a sentiment.
And there's this like playfulness to them
Yeah.
that I think is really delightful.
And speaking of capturing feelings, there's that great American idiom for when someone is, maybe acting a little crazy, a little irrational. They've lost their
Oh, I
marbles.
love that one. It's such a playful way of describing someone who's just a little unhinged.
Right. Like
Yeah.
their sanity has literally rolled away.
Exactly. But it's interesting how even with these, distinct American and British idioms, there are still quite a few that we share.
Oh, absolutely. Like pulling someone's leg.
Yes.
That's a classic.
Classic.
On both sides of the Atlantic. No actual leg pulling required.
Of course not. And who hasn't let the cat out of the bag accidentally?
right.
Regardless of where they're from.
Exactly. And these shared idioms, I think they just highlight the enduring connection between British and American English, despite their differences.
Yeah, it's like we've both been on these incredible linguistic journeys, each taking our own path,
Right.
but often, crossing paths and sharing these little gems of language along the way.
I love that. So as we wrap up our idiom odyssey, I think the biggest takeaway is that idioms, they're not just these, these quirky sayings we use. They're like linguistic fossils.
Oh, that's good.
Each one contains clues about our history, our culture, how we see the world.
Beautifully put. They really remind us that language is alive. It's dynamic. It's constantly, constantly evolving alongside us.
It is. So the next time you encounter like a head-scratching idiom, don't just brush it aside.
Yeah.
Take a moment, dig a little deeper, explore its potential origins. You never know what linguistic treasures you might unearth.